Hi guys, today we are going to tell you this story that many people still refuse to talk about, a story that was not whispered in ancient times, not passed down through myths, but recorded in the modern world when cameras, newspapers, and professional investigators already existed. Today's miracle is absolutely real. I will explain it to you all with evidence. Those who do not believe in ghosts should watch this video till the end. Those who believe in ghosts should definitely watch the video because after this, you may finally understand that ghosts really exist. What you are about to hear is not a rumor created on the internet. It is not a fictional horror story. It is not a dramatic exaggeration. This case was written down, investigated, photographed, and witnessed by dozens of people. And the year was 1933. Now let me ask you something. What if a house could remember pain? What if walls could hold memories? And what if those memories were strong enough to be seen, heard, and followed? Because in a quiet English village, far away from big cities and loud crowds, there stood a house that would eventually be called the most haunted house in the country. A house where footsteps walked with no body, where bells rang without hands, where messages appeared on walls by themselves, and where a silent figure walked again and again as if trapped between two worlds. People didn't go there looking for ghosts. They went there to live normal lives, but no one stayed normal for long. This story begins in the English countryside, where the land itself felt old, heavy with history. Long before the house was built, villagers avoided the area. They said something felt wrong. They spoke of shadows moving across open fields and a figure seen walking at night, dressed in old religious clothing, never speaking, never responding. Years later, when a large Victorian house was finally built on that land, people believed the strange stories would stop. They didn't. From the very beginning, the house felt different. Visitors felt watched. Sounds echoed through empty rooms. Doors opened and closed on their own. But these things were subtle at first, easy to ignore, easy to explain away. Until they were. Families who lived in the house began hearing footsteps in the hallways at night. Heavy, slow footsteps, as if someone was walking carefully. Deliberately, but when they opened the doors, no one was there. Bells rang violently without being touched. Objects moved, and then people started seeing her. A tall, silent figure, dressed like a nun, her face pale, her expression empty. She didn't scream, she didn't threaten. She simply appeared and walked, sometimes through gardens, sometimes through walls, sometimes directly toward witnesses. And when people tried to speak to her, she vanished. Now many people think ghosts are supposed to be dramatic, screaming, attacking, throwing people across rooms. But the most terrifying hauntings are the quiet ones, the ones that don't want to scare you, the ones that want something. As the years passed, the activity inside the house grew stronger. What started as strange sounds became undeniable events. Visitors who didn't know the history described the same things, the same sounds, the same figure, the same feeling of pressure, fear, and sadness. Some residents tried to stay brave, others broke down, some refused to sleep inside the house ever again. And then in the early 1930s, the case reached the attention of professional investigators. This is where everything changes, because this was no longer just a haunted house story. This became an official investigation. In 1933, a well-known paranormal researcher arrived at the house, not to believe, but to document. He brought notebooks, witnesses, schedules, and controls. He invited skeptics, he invited journalists, he invited ordinary people to stay inside and record everything they experienced. And once the investigation began, the activity exploded. Footsteps became louder, objects were thrown across rooms in front of witnesses, and most disturbing of all, words began appearing on the walls, not scratches, not stains, actual words, messages written in crude handwriting appearing where nothing had been before, messages that begged, messages that demanded. Messages that terrified the people who read them. Some witnesses claimed they watched the writing form in real time. No one was touching the wall, no one was near it, and yet the words appeared. This was no longer something that could be ignored. Newspapers began reporting on it. Photographs were taken, logs were signed, statements were written. This was happening in the modern world. Now let me be clear about something. Not everyone who investigated this case believed in ghosts. Many went in convinced it was fake, but some of those same skeptics left shaken because they experienced things they could not explain. Now here is the detail that connects this story to something much older, something far more disturbing. During renovations and investigations, human bones were discovered, hidden, buried, exactly where legends said they would be. Just like the ancient case we discussed earlier, the haunting seemed tied to forgotten remains. Once the bones were uncovered and given a proper burial, some of the activity reportedly decreased. That pattern should sound familiar. Something appears, something leads the living, something wants to be found. Now stop for a moment and think. How does a story from ancient Athens match a case from 1933? Two different countries, two different centuries, two completely different cultures, yet the same pattern repeats. A presence, a forgotten body, a haunting that ends with acknowledgement. Coincidence or something humanity still doesn't understand? This is not just a ghost story. This is a story about memory, about injustice, about things that refuse to stay hidden. This is only the beginning, because once the investigation officially began, the house did not calm down. It reacted, almost as if it knew it was being watched. When the investigators settled inside, they did not arrive with fear. They arrived with notebooks, cameras, schedules, and rules. Every sound was to be logged. Every movement was to be recorded. Every witness was to sign their name next to what they experienced. The goal was simple: prove that nothing paranormal was happening, but the house had other plans. On the very first nights of observation, the footsteps returned clearer than before, not soft creaks, not settling wood. These were heavy, deliberate steps moving from room to room. Witnesses followed the sound, expecting to find another investigator playing a trick. They found nothing. The footsteps continued even when the halls were empty. Then objects began to move. A small stone lifted from the floor and flew across a room, striking a wall in front of multiple witnesses. No strings, no hands, no one close enough to touch it. Later, keys disappeared and reappeared in different locations. A glass shattered without being touched. Bells rang violently while everyone stood still, watching. And then the writing began. At first, it was faint. Smudges on the wall that looked like they could be dirt or moisture, but within days the marks became clear letters. Words, messages, written in places no one had touched. They appeared suddenly, sometimes overnight, sometimes while people were present. Investigators checked the walls. They were dry, no hidden ink, no chalk, no trick paint. The messages were disturbing. They were not random. They were emotional. Some were short, some were desperate. They asked for prayers. They asked for help. They claimed to be trapped. And the most frightening part, the handwriting remained consistent, as if written by the same hand. Night after night, different people stayed inside the house. Skeptics, volunteers, journalists, ordinary men and women who had never believed in ghosts before. Many of them left early. Some refused to sleep alone. Others reported the same thing: a sudden coldness, a pressure in the air, a feeling of being watched from just behind their shoulder. One witness described the feeling as standing next to someone invisible, close enough to feel their presence but unable to see them. And then once again she appeared, the silent figure, the nun. She was seen walking through the gardens at dusk, gliding rather than stepping. Witnesses said she never made a sound, she never looked directly at anyone. She simply walked the same path again and again, as if repeating something she had done long ago. Some people saw her through windows, some saw her in doorways. Some claimed she passed straight through walls. Each description matched: tall, pale, still, not threatening, not violent, just endlessly present. And that terrified people more than any scream ever could, because it raised a horrifying possibility. What if this presence was not aware of the living at all? What if it was simply repeating something over and over, like a memory burned into the land? As the weeks passed, the investigation intensified. More observers arrived. More documentation was collected. Photographs were taken of rooms before and after activity. Schedules were tightened to prevent fraud. Still, things happened. One night, a loud crash echoed through the house. Investigators rushed to the sound and found overturned furniture that had been inspected and positioned carefully earlier that evening. Another night, stones were thrown down staircases while everyone stood together in a locked room. No one was alone. No one could be blamed. And then came one of the most unsettling moments of the entire case. A message appeared that referenced something no one had spoken about aloud, something private, something only one investigator knew. That investigator later stated that at that moment he stopped believing this was a hoax, because a trick requires knowledge, and no one else had it. As fear grew, so did rumors. People began whispering about the land again, about old legends, about buried remains. about secrets hidden inside the walls, so the investigators searched. They examined the structure. They checked behind panels. They explored the garden and surrounding ground. And then they found bones, human bones, not in a proper grave, not marked, hidden, buried where no burial should have been. The discovery sent shockwaves through everyone involved, because now the story was no longer just about strange sounds and moving objects. It was about a real human being who had been hidden and forgotten. The bones were removed and examined. They were later reburied respectfully, and something changed. The activity did not stop completely, but it weakened. The footsteps became less frequent. The writing slowed. The sightings became rarer. Once again, the pattern repeated. Something restless, something hidden, something revealed, something that finally began to quiet down. But even then, the house never truly became normal. Years later, people would still report strange feelings when passing by. Sudden chills. Unexplained sadness, a sense of heaviness that came without warning, as if something had been calmed but not erased. Now ask yourself this. If this was all imagination, why did it follow such a clear pattern? Why did it respond to investigation? Why did it react to being observed? Why did it weaken after remains were found and honored? These are not the behaviors of simple fear. Fear does not write messages. Fear does not throw stones. Fear does not reveal secrets. And this is where the case becomes truly unsettling, because whether you call it a ghost, an imprint, a psychological phenomenon, or something we don't yet have a name for, something was communicating. Something wanted acknowledgement, something wanted to be known. And that is where the house stopped being just a location and started becoming a test. Because once the remains were found and the activity changed, the investigators began to ask a new question, not what was happening, but who was being affected. And the answer was disturbing. The house did not treat everyone the same. Some people entered and felt nothing. Others walked in and immediately felt fear, sadness, or pressure in their chest. A few experienced events so intense that they refused to ever return. And these were not weak-minded people. They were teachers, clergy, journalists, scientists, men and women trained to observe, not imagine. One investigator later said something chilling. He said the house felt selective. As if it was choosing when to act and who to act upon. People began keeping detailed personal logs, not just of what they saw, but how they felt. Over time, patterns emerged. Activity increased late at night. It intensified during quiet moments. It seemed to grow stronger when people were alone, but not always. Sometimes it happened in front of everyone. That inconsistency made it harder to dismiss. If this was a trick, why wasn't it predictable? If this was fear, why didn't it affect everyone equally? Then came the psychological strain. Some observers reported headaches that started the moment they entered the house. Others felt sudden exhaustion, as if their energy was being drained. A few described hearing whispers, not loud enough to understand, but clear enough to know they were not imagining silence. One woman broke down in tears without knowing why. Another felt overwhelming guilt, as if she had done something wrong, even though she hadn't. And then there were the dreams. Multiple people reported dreaming about the same thing. Long corridors, cold stone walls, a feeling of being trapped, and a presence nearby watching. These people had not shared their experiences with each other, yet the dreams matched. Now let's pause here, because this is where skeptics usually say suggestion, but suggestion requires communication. These people were isolated, their logs were private, their experiences were recorded before discussion. So how do separate minds arrive at the same imagery? The investigators began reviewing the house's history in more detail. Old records, church documents, local accounts, and slowly a darker picture formed. The land had a past filled with secrecy. Not just one death, not just one burial, multiple stories of confinement, punishment, silence, people who disappeared, people whose names were never written down, people whose endings were hidden. And suddenly the messages on the walls made more sense. They weren't threats, they weren't warnings, they were pleas, requests for prayers, requests for remembrance, requests to be acknowledged. That is when one investigator wrote something that still unsettles historians today. He wrote, "It does not feel like something that wants to scare us. It feels like something that wants us to know it existed." Now think about that. What if the presence was not trying to haunt the house? What if it was trying to leave a record? Just like the investigators were documenting it, it was documenting itself. This idea terrified some people more than the thought of a violent ghost ever could, because it suggests intention, awareness, purpose. As the months passed, tension among the investigators grew. Accusations were made, some suspected exaggeration, others suspected fraud, but whenever doubt grew too strong, something would happen again. A sudden noise, an object moving, a message appearing. Almost as if the house was reacting to disbelief. One skeptic openly mocked the investigation during the day. That night he was awakened by footsteps circling his bed. He later admitted he slept with the lights on for the rest of his stay. Now here is the detail that most people overlook. The activity did not escalate into violence. No one was attacked, no one was possessed, no one was harmed. That absence matters, because hoaxes often try to shock, fear often escalates. But this remained controlled, measured, focused, as if the presence knew exactly how far to go. And that brings us to one of the most unsettling theories ever proposed about this case. What if this wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense? What if it was something like a recording, a moment of suffering replaying itself, a memory embedded into the environment, a loop that reactivates under certain conditions? This theory explains a lot: why the figure walked the same path, why the messages repeated similar themes, why the activity followed patterns instead of chaos. It also explains why acknowledgement weakened the phenomenon. Once the remains were found, once the story was told, once the injustice was recognized, the loop began to lose strength. But it didn't disappear completely, because memory does not vanish, it fades. And that may be the most terrifying idea of all, that places can remember. That suffering leaves marks not just on people, but on walls, ground, and air. And if that is true, how many places like this exist? Places where something happened so intense, so painful that it never fully went away. And that discomfort is exactly where this case lives. Because as the reports spread and the investigation gained attention, not everyone was convinced. In fact, the louder the story became, the stronger the opposition grew. Critics began to question every detail. Newspapers that once reported the events with curiosity now printed doubt. Skeptics stepped forward, determined to prove that everything happening inside that house had a simple explanation. They claimed exaggeration, they claimed coincidence, they claimed manipulation. Some accused the investigators of wanting fame. Others suggested that stressed witnesses were influencing one another without realizing it. A few even suggested deliberate fraud tricks performed in the dark to keep the story alive. And this is where the case became even more complicated, because some accusations were not entirely unreasonable. A few witnesses were caught contradicting themselves on minor details. Certain events could not be independently verified, and one of the main investigators had a reputation that made people suspicious, a reputation for drama, for bold claims, for pushing boundaries. This damaged the case, but it did not destroy it. Because even when the most aggressive critics stripped the story down to its bare minimum, something remained. There were still multiple witnesses who never changed their accounts. There were still events recorded before media attention arrived. There were still experiences reported by people who gained nothing from lying. And there were still physical discoveries that could not be erased. The bones had existed before the investigation. The land's history existed before the investigation. And the legends predated the house itself. That is what made it impossible to completely dismiss. The critics wanted one clear answer. Was it fake or was it real? But this case refused to fit into either category, because even if some events were exaggerated, not all of them could be. And that uncertainty is terrifying. One skeptic who reviewed the entire case later admitted something unsettling. He said even if 90% of this was explained, the remaining 10% is deeply troubling. That 10% is where this story survives. Now let's talk about timing. The most intense activity did not happen randomly. It happened when the house was occupied, observed, and emotionally charged. When attention faded, the activity faded too. When people returned with curiosity and skepticism, it returned. That pattern suggests interaction, not randomness, not decay, interaction. And here is the detail that divides people the most. Some witnesses reported that the presence reacted differently depending on how people behaved. Those who mocked it experienced fear. Those who ignored it experienced discomfort. Those who treated it with respect experienced calm. No violence, no punishment, just response. If this was a hoax, it was an incredibly controlled one. If this was psychology, it was an incredibly precise one. And if this was something else, then it was aware. Now imagine being one of the people who stayed inside that house after the controversy began. You know others think it's fake, you know you might be mocked, you know your reputation could suffer. And yet you still hear footsteps, you still feel watched, you still see movement where nothing should be. Would you speak up? Many didn't. Some witnesses waited years before talking, others never did, and that silence matters because hoaxes thrive on attention. Fear thrives on reaction, but silence usually belongs to people who are unsure or afraid of being believed. As the years passed, the house eventually fell quiet. It was damaged, later destroyed. The physical structure no longer exists, but the records do, the photographs do, the signed statements do, and most importantly, the pattern does. A place with a dark past, a presence that appears without violence, a connection to forgotten remains, a reduction in activity after acknowledgement. We have seen this before. Not just in ancient Athens, not just in this house, but in stories across time, which leads to the most uncomfortable realization of all. What if these cases are not rare? What if they are common but only visible under the right conditions? Quiet, attention, time. What if most people simply walk past them? And what if the reason science struggles with these cases is not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening doesn't behave like we expect? And this is where everything finally comes together. Because when we step away from the arguments, the accusations, and the debates, one truth remains untouched. Something happened in that house that changed people. Not one person, not two, but dozens, across different backgrounds, beliefs, and professions. And that matters because belief can be argued with, fear can be dismissed, but shared experience is harder to erase. The house itself is gone now. Its walls no longer stand. Its rooms no longer echo with footsteps, but the story did not disappear with it. It stayed alive in records, in letters, in photographs, and in the memories of those who were there. And that raises a powerful question. If the structure is gone, why does the story still feel unfinished? Maybe because the house was never the real mystery. The real mystery was human experience. Why did so many people, independent of each other, report the same feelings? Why did they describe the same figure? Why did they react in such similar ways? Skeptics will say coincidence, believers will say proof, but somewhere in between is something more important, meaning the presence in that house, whatever it was, did not act like something evil. It did not hunt people, it did not attack, it did not destroy, it appeared, it repeated, it waited. That behavior tells us something. It suggests memory rather than malice. It suggests unfinished business rather than rage. It suggests that something wanted to be acknowledged, not feared, and this idea connects ancient history to modern times. From the haunted house in Athens to this case in 1933, the pattern remains the same. A hidden truth, forgotten remains, a disturbance that ends when the truth is brought into the light. 2,000 years apart, same story, different world, which leads us to the final and most uncomfortable question of all. What if these stories exist not to scare us, but to remind us that suffering leaves marks, that injustice does not vanish quietly, that some stories demand to be told? Maybe ghosts are not proof of another world, maybe they are echoes of this one. And maybe the reason these cases survive centuries of doubt is because they sit right at the edge of what we understand, where logic meets emotion and history meets memory. You don't have to believe in ghosts to respect the mystery. You only have to admit that not everything fits neatly into explanations, and that sometimes the past reaches forward. Now, before we end, if this story made you think, if it gave you chills, or if it made you question what you believe about the unseen, make sure you subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next mystery. Hit the like button if you want more real, documented paranormal cases. And most importantly, leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and never stop questioning what lingers in the dark.